And now on your screen is Professor Kristina Miler of the University of Maryland. She's a professor of American politics, and she's also the author of this book, Constituency Representation in Congress, The View from Capitol Hill. Professor Miler, you write in the introduction to your book, or even before the introduction, that overall, legislators' views of constituents are limited and flawed, and even well-meaning legislators cannot represent their constituents if they do not accurately see who is in their district. What does that mean?
Well, I think much of our attention has focused on the possibility that legislators are being actively corrupted or making decisions to vote against their constituents. But what we've neglected is the whole part of the backstory, kind of what happens before they get to those decisions. And what I'm really interested in this book is the role that cognitive psychology can play in informing our understanding of elected officials. So psychologists have long had this sense that we have limitations as humans, mental limitations. We don't use all the information possible. We don't conduct information searches every time somebody asks us a question. And so there's this vast literature on kind of our cognitive limits and the shortcuts we take to make sense of the world, to make decisions. But that has somewhat been applied in some studies of foreign policy, but really not within American politics. So what I'm interested in is, how do legislators perceive their constituents? When we say, what do your constituents want? Who are they thinking of? Because they represent 700,000 people, and there's no way they're thinking of all of them. So what does the district look like in their mind? And then that's the first question. And then once we figure that out, we can think about how does that affect how they behave. So that's where this book takes off.
So when you ask a legislator, a member of the House of Representatives, what do your constituents want? What is his or her thought process?
So that's exactly what I get at in the book. I conducted a bunch of interviews, over 80 interviews on the Hill with legislators and their staff, and I asked kind of who in the district is this important to? So not who are you going to do something for, just who does it even matter to? And what I was struck by is there are anywhere some relevant number of constituents, and legislators don't see all of them. They don't come to mind. And so in the day-to-day business of Congress, when there's meetings, when there's committee hearings, and the legislator thinks, okay, who in the district cares about this? They're actually not seeing everybody in the district that does care about the issue. So for instance, something like the Patient's Bill of Rights, since I focused on healthcare issues, you would think everybody would think patients, but they don't. Right? A sizable minority, almost 40% of interviews, legislators aren't thinking about patients when they were thinking about that type of legislation. They were thinking about hospitals, they were thinking about physicians, they were thinking about insurers, but they weren't always thinking about patients. And this is replayed on issue after issue. So their view of who is in their district relevant to the issue is actually quite limited.
So taking that Patient's Bill of Rights, if a legislator gets 100 letters, et cetera, on that issue from people who have been in the hospital, do those matter?
Absolutely. So one of the things in trying to understand, first there was a question of who do they see? Just a very descriptive but surprisingly neglected question. And so I find that it's limited. And then I want to figure out, well, why is it that some legislators see some groups and some legislators see other constituents? What explains that? And so I look at things like contact from constituents. I looked at financial contributions. I look at things like party ties. And what I find is that really what matters is contributions and contact. Now, one of those is a slightly happier story for democracy, right? And that's the story about contact in some sense, which is that what we're all taught in elementary school and high school, that write to your congressperson, actually matters. And the way that I would argue it matters is it shapes who they think is in the district. It shapes their perception of who the constituency is. And then they can use that later on, as I go into later on in the book, to shape their conscious, deliberate decisions, like how to participate, how to vote, what bills to sponsor. But first, it has to have this subtle effect that I call mental access, kind of shaping their worldview. And that's actually one way that writing to your congressperson does seem to matter.
So what's the next step then?
Well, we should all write to our congressperson is one thing. Certainly if there are issues that you care about, and I think in this day and age it's easy to feel cynical that those letters just get answered by some staffer and aren't important, but they are having this effect of shaping how they view their district, and that makes a big difference. On the other hand, in terms of financial contributions, that has a slightly less positive spin. So one of the struggles for academic political scientists is we long feel that money matters in congressional politics, but there's very mixed evidence from an academic scholarship side on this. And what I find is that the money matters in this very subtle way, again, by shaping how they view the district. So I think that kind of helps to bridge the lack of a smoking gun, so to speak, of kind of the evidence of money buying politics, with that gut feeling that money in politics is doing something. And what I think here it's doing is it's shaping how they view the district. And so if you're a constituent or a constituency group that's giving more money, you're more likely to be seen and have your voice heard by your member of Congress.
Well, Professor Miler, let's say you're representing Detroit, you're representing car companies, auto workers, et cetera. You're doing what you think is right for the auto workers and for the car companies. In turn, they're giving you donations because they support your work. Isn't that how it's supposed to work, though? Representing your constituents?
It is supposed to work that way in some sense. I think the concern is that one of the bars that kind of democratic theorists have talked about setting for representation is a very low bar, I would argue, and it's simply that an elected representative is aware of the distribution of the different constituents in the district, just aware of them. Then how the legislator chooses to act from there is a whole host of other factors: party, ideology, their own beliefs about what's best for their constituents or what's best for the country. That low bar of just being aware of constituents isn't even being met in the modern Congress. So there's a lot of constituents that are unseen. Now, of course, there's going to be tough choices, right? And so the book isn't saying that the standard is acting for every constituent's interest, because of course that's impossible. But to at least be aware that there's interests out there seems to be pretty important.
Professor Miler, in your research and work, do you find that congressional districts are too big?
That is one of the implications that I think can be drawn out of this work. So these limited and biased perceptions end up shaping their behavior, and I trace this out by looking at participation in committees. So are they asking questions? What type of comments are they making? I look at their voting record, and I find that legislators who are sponsoring or see a more complete, more balanced district actually tend to vote more moderately. They tend to sponsor more bills. So it does have these real impact. Now, the reason that I think that congressional districts may be too big is representation is really a tough job. I think that's one of the things to emerge out of this book. Psychologists have been telling us kind of all these limitations we as humans have, and legislators and their staff are human too, and so they're subject to the same limitations. And we're asking them to do a really difficult job. To represent 750,000 people, or close to on average in the House, is tough. And so I think that if the size of the district was made smaller, it wouldn't totally eliminate these shortcuts that are necessary, right? The need to just go with the information that's most accessible, because that's really the mechanism here that's at work. Just like you or I, if somebody asks us a question, we answer it based on the information that comes to mind. Legislators and their staff do the same. The information that comes to mind, however, is limited and is biased. And if it's you or I, it's not that big a deal. But if it's a politician making decisions, it can matter a lot.
So mentally, psychologically, what information are we leaving out of our decision or not aware that we're making a decision based on?
Yeah, so in the context of legislative decision-making in Congress, I think I focused on information about constituents specifically. Now, there may be other types of information, too, that would benefit from being looked at with this framework, but that aren't what I focused on. I was really interested in this question about constituency representation, because for so long, scholars just say, oh, they represent the district, or constituents matter, and really wanting to unpack what that actually means, who's actually involved.
What do you teach here at the university?
I teach a class on the U.S. Congress, also a class on interest groups, and some classes on social movements, and introduction to American government. So trying to get as many incoming freshmen and sophomores interested in political science as I can.
Do national interest groups affect constituency representation?
I think they do. Interest groups per se weren't the focus of this research, although I have done other work focusing specifically on legislative lobbying. I think the way that they can really impact how legislators perceive their district is by encouraging their members to make contact with them. That's something that we know that national interest groups are really good at, is making it easy to send a letter, send an email. They give you form letters even sometimes, and just facilitating that process. I think that makes a big difference, and this book suggests that it shapes how legislators then act.
So, Professor Miller, we're going through a redistricting period right
Yes.
now for the U.S. Congress. Would it make sense to make districts more homogeneous, thus being